they can play video games like crazy because that's all they did when they were growing up. And so, you know, the dad that has the 6-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old that says, okay, you know, you're not doing anything, come jog with me. Going to create a greater percentage of slow twitch fibers. So engaging in multiple sports that produce explosive movements when you're young sets up the contraction characteristics of the muscle fibers. Now here's the bad news. For y'all out there, it's too late. You're stuck with what you got. Even with your teenage athletes, you're kind of stuck with what you got. But you can teach slow twitch fibers and, more importantly, intermediate fibers to act more like fast twitch fibers and to be able to produce a big force in a relatively short time. We worked with the United States bobsled team that won the bronze medal in Park City, Utah. So we've cut across a lot of different sports. Contractile versus elastic force production. So we know that when the muscle shortens, it produces force. That's contractile force production. Elastic force production is, so for example, and Pablo Comey did a lot of research on this, as well as Carmelo Bosco, comparing the squat jump with the counter movement jump versus the drop jump. And what you can do when you measure these three characteristics, you can determine how elastic an athlete is, or how elastic an athlete has become. Because if you're an elastic athlete, your counter movement jump should be higher than your squat jump, because you're using stress shortening cycle. And you're able to recruit more muscle fiber, but more importantly, you're able to store the energy in the non-contractile tissue, the connective tissue. You're able to store the energy there. Now what you do is you compare the counter movement jump with a very small drop jump, and then increase, and then increase, and then increase. And your elastic animals will jump higher with a small drop jump than they did with a counter movement jump. And you can get people to change the nervous system in order to be able to do this. And then what's going to happen is you get to where their maximum jump is, and then the next height, it stays the same. When you're doing drop jump training in your strength training or in your power training on the track, that's the height that athlete needs to be able to drop at. And if you can record the amount of time that the athlete is on the ground, this is also a big characteristic, because you want to be on the ground about 0.12 seconds. 0.12 seconds, and then that's the target height. Joint stabilization versus body propulsion. And so in the weight room, we do a lot of contractile muscle contraction, moving the weights. And that produces the ability to project the body's center of mass. But when you land on the ground, you have to have joint stabilization strength. And so that's why a sprinter, if you're looking at squats, we want to do 5 parallel squats, so below 90 degrees. Why? Because that's the development of the strength, the propulsive strength out of the front block, which should be at about 90 degrees. Then you want to do 90 degrees, and then you want to do quarter squats. Why quarter squats? Well, because when you hit the ground, it's a little bit like a quarter squat. And of course, you can lift much more in a quarter squat position. And then you have to do speed squats, where I take about what my body weight is, and I go up and down 10 times. Not necessarily jump squats. Not a big fan of jump squats because it puts so much pressure on the back. If you've got a belt and you've got like a Kaiser machine, and you can attach the belt to the Kaiser machine, you can jump that way because you're not putting pressure on your back. And this is how we start to look at developing joint stabilization versus body propulsion. Okay, this is what we talked about with the little elbow trick. So, joint position dictates muscle recruitment. Neuromuscular inhibition, and that's what that we saw there, the joint position actually inhibited the muscle. You have neuromuscular facilitation. By putting the joint position in the proper thing, the muscle can work in a better way. Plantar flexion versus dorsiflexion, for example. And then you have a neuromechanical advantage or disadvantage. And this is by positioning a joint, you can either facilitate or reduce the capacity to produce force. This is so important in recovering the limb. So in physical therapy, there's a concept called passive and active insufficiency. And so passive insufficiency deals with the position of the joint and the static position of the joint, which is what we showed you here. Active insufficiency deals with how one joint moving changes the dynamic of the other joint moving. So we've got single joint hip flexors, and these are the muscles that we normally think about bringing the leg from the back of the body to the front of the body. So, as a muscle shortens, it loses its mechanical advantage. So if we look at these one joint hip flexors, if they're over lengthened, they don't have good mechanical advantage. Then you reach a range of motion where they have good mechanical advantage, and then when you get to here, they're so short they can't produce force anymore. And so people think, I'm going to do these exercises in order to be able to get good hip flexion. Well, what happens is the leg is moving so fast, when it gets to here, these muscles are short and can't produce force anyway. And so what happens is actually the momentum of the thigh that brings the leg up through the final range of motion. So the iliacus, the psoas, the pectineus, which is a little small muscle way up here that attaches from the pubic ramus down to the lesser trochanter. And then the gluteus medius, which is one that people don't think of as a hip flexor. The gluteus medius can be turned off just like the gluteus maximus can be turned off. And so these one joint hip flexors we'll find out function through a partial range of motion. Now you have two joint hip flexors. These are muscles that cross two joints. And so if you want to have maximum force production at the hip joint, you have to momentarily fix the knee joint angle. Okay? And these muscles are the following. The sartorius, which starts up here and goes down like this. So it's a hip flexor and a knee flexor. The rectus femoris, which is probably one of the more important ones, it's a hip flexor, but it's a co-knee extensor with the vastus muscles. And then finally, the one that people forget about is called the tensor fasciae lati. It's a small muscle over here that attaches up near the iliac crest, and it's a hip flexor, but it's a knee flexor. It's a small little muscle. How can it do that? Because it goes through what we call the iliotibial band and goes all the way down and attaches on the lateral aspect of the fibula. So it flexes the knee, but flexes the hip. if you want to see how important this little muscle is, look at some of the best male and even some of the best female sprinters in the world. It looks like they have a tennis ball stuck in their shorts because it's a huge bulge here. That's called muscle hypertrophy. That's because they've been using it and strengthening it over their career. So it's extremely, extremely important. And when your athlete starts to develop these characteristics, you know that, aha, they're firing this muscle appropriately. Now, the key point is that in order to be an effective hip flexor, the knee cannot do this at takeoff. Boop. At takeoff, as soon as you see the foot go up and go into flexion, you switched off the two joint hip flexors. So what does that cause? The technical term is dangle time. Yeah? It's dangling behind your body. So the foot comes off the ground, the knee comes up, and the thigh actually continues to go backwards. This is pushing against the air. Unless you have jet propulsion, this is not going to help you. And so figuring out, okay, how do we cue this properly in order to get it right? So if you can see here, you can see the sartorius, and then up top you can see the iliacus to the left, the psoas, and the pectineus. And you can see that they function together. And again, you can see from the side. But this looks at more like the hip extensors and what's happening with the hamstrings and the gluteal muscles. Okay, let's talk about velocity. You don't run faster by trying harder. You know, you see people flailing around and the face, the pull, and all looking ugly, and you know, it doesn't help to try harder. You have to try softer. So velocity is a product of step length. So in the literature, step is from right foot to left foot. Stride is from right foot to right foot. So a stride is a double step. So if you're looking at data and the data looks funny compared to what you would express, then they're not talking about steps, they're talking about strides. This happens a lot in distance running. They'll talk about strides. Jack Daniels, in a lot of his research, talk about stride length. And step frequency. Step frequency is the number of steps you take per second. And we saw by our example, if you reduce the amount of time that it takes you to put the required force into the ground, and you reduce the amount of time that it takes to recover the limb, step frequency goes up. So the question was, back in 1983, for about 10 years, when Dr. Ralph Mann was working with then the Athletics Congress and then USA Track and Field, which is more important, step length or step frequency? And about 50% of the coaches said step frequency, and about 50% of the coaches said step length. And there were arguments all back and forth about that. And, well, let's try to figure it out without arguing. Here's the equation for velocity. It's step length in meters times step frequency in the number of steps per second. And that gives you meters per second, gives you velocity. Now, what if we reframe this equation a little bit? This is your algebra lesson for this Saturday morning. Velocity divided by step frequency equals step length. So what has the powerful effect on step length? It's the speed you're running. Now, we're going to share with you the amount of time in the air. There is an optimal time. Too short is bad. Too long is even worse. The optimal air time, and you'll think this is funny, is 0.123 seconds. To be less than that doesn't allow you to fly very far. To be greater than 0.123 seconds means that you're generating excessive vertical velocity, which increases the amount of time you have in the air. Well, what happens when you increase vertical velocity? Think of the difference between the long jump and the high jump. Yeah, in the long jump, you don't have high vertical velocity at all. 20 degrees maybe. In the high jump, it's very much vertical. How fast are you traveling when you leave the ground horizontally in the high jump? Not very fast, because you put the brakes on to generate greater vertical velocity. So if we see an athlete with a higher amount of air time than 0.123, they're probably braking. They probably have their foot too far out in front of their center of mass. And so step frequency, the amount of time that it takes you to put the force in the ground, and the amount of time it takes you to recover the limb through the air and put the next step on the ground, is more important than step length. Step length is a product of how you put the force into the ground. So let's look at step length and understand step length a little bit better, because this is extremely important. Actual step length is the point of the touchdown from the right foot to the point of touchdown on the left foot. Now, I remember I was coaching at Louisiana State University, and we went to the cinder track, the dirt track, at the middle school, and we smoothed it out, and we put the timing gates up, and the first person ran through with their spikes, and we got out our tape measures, and we measured from the right toe to the left toe, and from the left toe to the right toe, and what do you suppose the next person looked like? Coach is measuring stride length, measuring step length. We're going to take big steps because that's what we want. And so they looked like they were bounding, they were taking such big steps. And so we had to explain, no, that's not exactly what we're looking for. But this is what we call actual step length. That's what's measured when you read the biomechanics literature. Effective step length is from the center of mass at takeoff to the center of mass at touchdown. It basically is the air distance. Yeah, it's the distance that the center of mass travels through the air in, hopefully, 0.123 seconds. So at greater velocities, the distance that the person travels in the air in the same amount of time is greater. But what about the distance that they travel on the ground? It's the same. It's from here, 1 foot length in front of the center of mass, or the hip joint, and then until takeoff. It's the same length. It just has to happen in less amount of time. Let's look at elite sprinters. Depending on leg length, okay? Because leg length, the greater the leg length, the greater the time on the ground. Why? Because if you have the same angle relative to the body here, and the leg is longer, it's going to be further out in front of the body, which means the athlete has to travel greater amount of distance in that front side ground phase. And so if you look at like Asafa Powell, Usain Bolt, some of those sprinters, their step length looks huge. But what we want to do is we want to look at how much time it takes them to put the force in the ground with that big step. So this is kind of a normal sprinter, and this is some of the best female sprinters in the world. So ground time is 800ths of a second. Air time, 0.123. Steps, 0.20 per step. That means 5 steps per second. This is the gold standard for top-level female sprinters that aren't super tall. You've got to be able to hit 5 steps per second. I coached an athlete by the name of Andre Kaysen who said he was 1.70 meters, but I think he was lying. And he ran in the first round of the United States Championships 9.79 seconds. Okay, the wind was just a little bit too high, so they didn't recognize it. But when Dr. Mann, and then he came back and ran the semifinals, 9.792. I looked at the wind gauge, it said 1.7. I about fainted. It was the wind gauge for the triple jump, not the 100 meters. 100 meters was 2.3. And then came back and okay, let's talk about building belief. So 9.79, even wind data is very fast. And so the press swamped him and interviews and everything. I finally grabbed him and stuck him in the car, took him back to the hotel. He said, "Do you think I can do that again?" What do you mean? You did it now, so why couldn't you do it again? This is the lack of confidence, the lack of belief that athletes possess. And in some cultures, it's greater than other cultures. So with our female athletes in Shanghai, we see this a lot more frequently than we do with our male athletes. You know, I'll try, I'll do my best, I don't know if I can be successful. One of the most important things a coach can do for an athlete is build belief. Build belief in the athlete that they have the confidence that they can execute. And there's a lot of different ways and strategies that you can do this. But his step frequency was 5.19 steps per second. He looked like the Roadrunner out there with his legs spinning so fast. And then Travis Padgett's another athlete, vertically challenged, that I worked with. He ran 5.09 steps per second and ran 983. So let's look at the developing sprinter. Developing sprinter sometimes takes up to 0.12 seconds to put the force into the ground, the required force, and is in the air significantly longer. We've seen 0.15. It looks like they're bounding down the track just about. 0.25 seconds, notice I kept the math simple, 4 steps per second. So let's look at what we're going to evaluate when we look at the athletes. The first thing is body position. This is absolutely critical, which is why the 3 little asterisks are there. If you have the wrong body position, nothing else can be right. The next thing, recovery mechanics. You've got to be able to get the leg from the back side of the body to the front side of the body as efficiently and as quickly as you possibly can. Transition phase. When the thigh meat reaches maximum flexion, that could be here, that could be here. It's the time that it takes the thigh to turn around and go back down into the ground. Ground preparation. This is how you're going to prepare the foot to strike the ground. If you do this, like you're stepping on a bug, you're going to have high braking forces because you have no negative foot speed. The foot is not traveling backwards very fast. If you do this and pull back a long leg under the body, generating a high negative foot speed, less braking forces. The ground phase, and we talked about this before, from touchdown to mid stance is front side, and from mid stance to takeoff is back side. And then finally, arm action. And I used to think, it's not so important. But I've come to learn it's quite effective as a teaching tool. Body position. We have to teach the athlete how to control their abdominal muscles. And also make sure that the opposing muscles, the muscles of the back, the supraspinatus, and most importantly, the quadratus lumborum, are in a relaxed position. And so we'll do exercises like laying the athlete on the floor and just having them touch their tummy and then flatten the back, relax the back. And notice the knees are bent. If you've got a tight iliopsoas, it has a tendency to pull the pelvis forward. So bending the knees is important. And then as you improve, you start walking the heels away from the butt. And you'll reach a point where you just can't keep the back flat on the ground. And then the next position we use is back up against the wall. So heels, butt, shoulders against the wall, press your tummy against the wall. We also use a tool called a Rotex. And what it is a double platform that they're against the wall and they draw in and brace, and then they internally rotate their legs. This does a couple things. One of the things that sprinters have is an imbalance between internal and external rotators. And so if you see a sprinter here running like this, it's not the feet that's the problem. It's their external rotators are much stronger than their internal rotators. The other thing, we talk about body position, everybody talks about the core. Yeah? The wraparound muscles, obviously, transverse abdominis, internal and external obliques, but it's a cylinder. It's got a top and a bottom. The top is the diaphragm, the bottom are the coccygeal muscles. And people don't know how to fire the coccygeal muscles, and so when you go to stabilize and bear down, the energy goes out through the bottom of the pelvis. So tummy tight, postural realignment, back flat, butt tucked under. We talk about visualizing the pelvis looking up. We tell them if the pelvis is like a bowl of soup, you're walking with the bowl of soup, what happens if the pelvis tips forward? The soup comes out of the bowl. So if I'm walking around like this, I don't have any soup in my bowl. If I'm here and I have my pelvis aligned here with a flat back, tight tummy, I can keep the soup in the bowl. And so one of our athletic trainers, when she would see one of our young developing athletes, she would just yell, "Soup!" And they'd go, "Whoop!" Because she knew what she was looking for. And then a longitudinal alignment. I say longitudinal rather than vertical because you want to see a line, what's called an arcuate line, from basically right behind the ear, through the shoulder, through the hip, behind the knee, and right through the ankle joint. This is the alignment that you want to see in a sprinter running at maximum speed. If they're bent forward or they're bent backward, or that's not optimal. Now the reason why we say longitudinal is when you're in acceleration, it's the same line, it's just at an angle to the ground, a different angle to the ground. So the same principle applies in acceleration as it does at maximum speed. So let's reframe kind of how we think about maximum velocity. So the quality of any phase of running mechanics, and let me define quality. People say quantity and quality. Yeah? So it's easy to measure quantity. How many meters did you run today? Okay, that's the quantity. And then a lot of coaches say quality, and they use it the same as intensity. It's not. Intensity is a percentage measure of maximum. Quality is a percentage measure of perfect. Yeah? So if you're looking for a high quality watch and you're talking to somebody from Switzerland, they're going to send you to Genève because they think they make the best watches in the world. And so we want quality movements. We want next to perfect movements. And this is something that, again, the athlete has to develop this conceptual technical model. But what's one of the most important tools for a coach? Video. So I spent 2 years in Hungary, and everybody was standing at the finish line with a stopwatch. 7.2, 8.3. What kind of feedback is that? Gives you no knowledge of results. And so what you will find is more than 70% of the athletes that you work with are what's called visual learners. If they can see it, they can do it. Coaches, this is why, unless you're really good at executing the drills and the movements, don't do it in front of the kids. My wife used to say, don't dance in front of the children. I'm not a very good dancer, obviously, at least according to her. And so, a relatively small percentage, maybe 20%, are visual learners, kinesthetic learners. So they will tell you, if I can feel the movement, I can do the movement. And so we will actually take the athletes and move their limbs through certain ranges of motion so that they can feel the impact from all the receptors, and that goes up to the brain and impacts it, and that gives them a better understanding. The smallest percentage of the way people learn are auditory learners. So if I give a bunch of instructions verbally to a group of athletes, they're going, la, 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 la. What am I having for dinner tonight? Because it doesn't impact them. Small percentage are auditory learners. And the largest percentage of that small percentage is female. And so guys, what I'm going to tell you now, I'm sorry to say it's true. If your significant other or spouse says that you only listen half as well as she does, she's probably right. Because women have language centers in both hemispheres of their brain. Men only have one language center in one side of their brain. And so, just if you get that advice, it's probably true. And so, understanding that the quality of a phase in the running mechanics, how perfect it is determined by the quality of the phase that immediately precedes it. So, what's the next question? What's the most important phase of running? It's the ground phase. It's unless you have jet propulsion, what you do on the ground is the most important thing that's going to determine your performance. So what's the phase before the ground phase? The ground preparation phase. So how you prepare the leg to strike the ground is going to determine the quality of the ground phase. The transition phase, how you hit the transition phase and how you come out of it is going to determine how you prepare for the ground phase. What determines the quality of transition phase? Recovery phase. From the moment of takeoff to the moment of maximum thigh flexion. What determines the quality of the recovery phase? The ground phase. So what happens is, as you start having things break down in the recovery phase and all these phases, and it starts impacting the ground phase, that just makes the other stuff worse too. And so understanding that where we have to start to try to reprogram the athlete's nervous system is at takeoff, or momentarily before takeoff, you have to be able to send the correct messages down. Because if you wait till the athlete is off the ground then to send the message, too late. It's called anticipatory firing. We need to send the message to make the muscles fire in anticipation of having them fire at the right time. So, this is an athlete I inherited. Her name started out being Tiana Madison, and she won the long jump in Helsinki. When was that? 2005? Can't remember. When she was only 18 years old. And then she went through a series of coaches and finally got with a coach that got her to a good performance in sprinting. She ran 9.89 seconds, but wasn't long jumping, and then he moved to Great Britain, and she ended up coming with me. So this is her first, what we call special help session. This is one-on-one with the coach and a high-speed camera, and this is what we're going to do with our athletes in the practical session. And so she's running through, she's doing a lot of things correctly, some things not correctly. Look at her body position. Tummy's tight, back's flat, shoulders are above the hips, head is in alignment. Now what you'll notice is there's a little bit of rotation going on around the spine. This is being used to store energy. There's a book that was published called The Spinal Engine, if you want to take a look at it. It describes what's happening here, and it looks like it's very insignificant, and you almost can't see it. Some people have too much, but it's a way that you can help store energy. Here's the other thing she does well. At takeoff, the thigh comes forward. Then the foot is lifted. So you can see the thigh comes forward, then the foot comes up. This causes the two joint hip flexors to work and get the thigh forward. And so you don't have the dangle time. When the knee bends and the foot comes up, it switches these off, and then you have things behind the body. The other thing she does well, and we'll walk through this, is the golden position. It's when the thigh is parallel, when the thigh is vertical and the shin is parallel. Here's the bad things she was doing. She's plantar flexion before she hits the ground. Can you see how she goes, boop? You can see her ankle get jammed up because she has so much braking forces from that. But again, this was the first session we did. She ended up running 10.83 seconds, led off the 4x100 meter relay team in London that set the world record for the United States. And oh, by the way, she jumped with me 7 meters 18. And she had a micro foul at 7 meters 38. So she made some big changes from this first try. Let's break it down a little bit. The residual phase. So residual is something you have left over. And so you can see she's at takeoff. Now, if the thigh continues to go backwards, this is wasting time. And so we should have no residual phase. The thigh needs to come immediately forward, which you saw in the slow motion video. Begins at takeoff, ends with positive acceleration of the thigh. And again, there should be no dangling behind the body. The recovery phase. So it begins when the thigh starts to come forward and ends when the thigh blocks up in full flexion, what we call the transition phase. So proper body position, remember, if the pelvis is tipped forward, you're not getting elastic stretch across the hip flexors and compromising the ability to flex the thigh. Toe up, thigh pop, and lift the heel up and forward. Lift the heel forward is Raina Ryder's cue. Thigh pop is this. Oosh. And so what we're going to do, is our demonstration athletes here today? Are they good? They won't know what we're going on. That's good. So we teach people how to kick someone in the shins. So here, that means engage the 2 joint hip flexors to have the thigh pop forward, rather than letting the heel flip up. So you're going to see how this really dramatically affects the person. And then, so this is the first golden position where it says 90 degrees. When the lower leg is parallel with the ground, the thigh should be vertical. It should be a 90-degree angle. What we typically see is when the lower leg is parallel with the ground, the knee angle is much greater than 90 degrees and the thigh isn't anywhere close to vertical. That means the leg is dangling behind the body. When the athlete touches down, the foot to the ground, the knees should be together. And in the best athletes, the recovery leg knee is actually in front of the support leg knee. Now, if you initiate the thigh pop correctly and have no dangle time, in the amount of time available, you'll be able to get the leg all the way up to thigh parallel. Just doing A skips and that doesn't work. And so this is a critical position here. Think of it, you have a certain amount of time in order to get the leg from the back side of the body to the front side of the body. Okay? If I pull the thigh forward at takeoff, I can get all the way up to 90 degrees. But if I continue to push and the leg goes back more after I leave the ground, I still have the same amount of time. And so you can't get the knee as high. And that's what, people spend a lot of time trying to do all these high knee drills, but it doesn't help much because they're over pushing on the ground, so they'll never reach the desired position. So here's our transition blocking of the thigh. So you want to eliminate the turnaround time. Now, okay, you don't want to have it floating in the air a long time. However, with the most elite sprinters, what ends up happening is there actually is a little bit of hang time. And then they start again. I don't teach that. That happens as a result of proper execution of the previous phases. There's some things that if you talk about it, the athlete says, I gotta hold my leg up higher and hold it up longer. No. That happens automatically if you do the things before that correctly. Ground preparation. So this is the second most important part of sprinting. It starts when you have negative thigh acceleration and comes into the ground when you have negative foot acceleration. So back in the day, back in the 60s, a sprint coach in the United States was called Bud Winter. And he used to teach what's called four-leg reach. What he said is you get to here, and then you kick the lower leg out, and then you pull back. That doesn't happen. You do not fire the quadriceps muscles to get the lower leg there. You get to here, and now no muscles are firing around the knee joint. And if I accelerate at the hip joint, and there are no muscles firing around the knee joint, my shoes are too squishy. This is what happens. The shin stays vertical. This is a passive opening of the lower leg. Ankles dorsiflexed, and now I pull back. So I want to have high angular acceleration at the hip joint, which produces high angular velocity, or high linear velocity at the knee. And when I get to here, the lower leg is not impacting at all on what's happening with the upper leg. But when I get to here, that's when all of the knee stabilizers fire, and I pull the leg back long. Okay, that's how you generate high negative foot speed. Dr. Mann, one of his first examples is, we're driving in a car. I'm on this side now, not on this side. Driving in a car, you're sitting in the passenger seat. The window's down, and you see a tree that's very close to the road. I'm going 60 kilometers per hour. You stick your hand out the window and bang! Your hand hits the tree. How fast was your hand going? 60 kilometers per hour, same as the vehicle. You become very angry. You see another tree and it looks like the other one, so maybe they're related. You take your hand and you rear it back and swing your arm forward at 60 kilometers per hour. I didn't slow down. Boom! What was the impact velocity? 120 kilometers per hour. So the braking forces, B-R-A-K-E, and B-R-E-A-K, because now you broke your hand, were 120 kilometers per hour. But you still want to touch a tree. I say, let's go to the hospital. No, I want to touch a tree. And so you take your hand and you put it forward, and you pull it back at 60 kilometers per hour, and your timing is very good, and you touch the tree. What was the braking forces of the impact velocity? 0. So if I'm traveling at 10 meters per second forward, and I pull my foot back at a high velocity, I'll never pull it back at 10 meters per second. If I pull it back at a high velocity, I minimize the braking forces. If I pull it back on a bent knee, I can't generate the same negative foot speed, so the braking forces are higher. Now, this is the difference between the basic technical model and the advanced technical model of sprinting. Younger athletes, and this is important, younger athletes don't have the strength in the glutes and the hamstring and the balance to be able to hit the ground with a long leg, because now the length tension relationship in the hamstring is very high. Yeah? The hamstring length is high. If you don't have enough cross bridges, if you're not strong enough in this position, your young athletes, even though they can execute the technical model correctly, they won't have the strength to be able to survive it. So they're going to hit the ground with a little bit more of a bent knee because the hamstring is shorter and you have more cross bridges. And so it's as a coach, understanding where that athlete is in their development and where their strength and powers and stabilization strength are before you really start emphasizing the advanced technical model. With the athletes in my group, many of them are young. I have a 15-year-old, but there are only 2 athletes that I teach the advanced technical model to. One is 28 and one is 26. And so they have a long developmental history, and they just this year have the right elastic capacity to be able to learn the advanced technical model. So sometimes even though you know it's important, at some stage you still don't teach it because the athlete's body isn't ready for it. So, and it ends with touchdown of the foot. So we want to have active back of the thigh. The knee joint is loose with the toe up, as we talked about. The knee joint is stabilized with co-contraction as you grab the foot under the body and impact the ground. So we need to explode through the ground. This is what's happening with 3 of our athletes. They get to here, and then they just tap the ground and kind of go through it, rather than pulling back long and projecting the hips through. And so that's going to be their next year goal, is to increase their specific strength and elastic strength and be able to do that. You want to feel like you're tearing back the track. So the mid-stance position, you want to feel that you have a firm leg. So there'll be a certain amount of absorption. The elite athletes, it's about 5 degrees. Not very much at all. And this depends, first of all, on when did you fire the muscles to stabilize the knee. You have to fire the muscles before you hit the ground to stabilize the knee, because if you hit the ground, it's too late, and then you fire, and then you push. The other thing is, they may not be strong enough to be able to stabilize those forces. And so, real critical there. Backside mechanics, too many people spend too much time pushing. If you look at the top sprinters, at maximum velocity, they rarely reach full knee extension. Yeah? Remember, the big money comes here. This is small money. Yeah, if I hire you to work an 8-hour job, and I say, okay, the first 6 hours you work, I'm going to give you $20 US. But the last 2 hours, I'm going to give you $3. What are you going to do? Work like 6 hours, go home, party, and forget about the chump change. Don't worry about that. So this stuff in the back doesn't help much. And again, look at some of the top sprinters. They actually leave the ground before they extend the back knee. Arm position focus. Okay, this was my philosophy, is that your arm action is like operating a vehicle on a one-way street. You only drive in one direction. What happens at 10? Is questions at 10? 10 minutes is questions? Okay. Okay. And then we're finished? I thought we'd go till 12 o'clock. Huh? Oh, break. Who needs a break? I'm doing all the work. So you only operate a vehicle like on a one-way street. You only drive in one direction. And drive stands for shoulder extension and hip extension. So you only do this. What? And you keep the elbow relatively flexed. There'll be a little bit of opening that causes a stretch across the biceps muscle. Yeah? And so here. But here, you get a stretch across the anterior deltoid, you get a stretch across the biceps muscle, and that is what's caused the elastic response. Does anyone recognize the actor named Steven Seagal? He played in a lot of exciting spy movies and different things. This is how he runs. Dog paddle. Yeah? And so one of our 400-meter runners, he does this at the end. Hurdlers with the trail arm that do this, not good. I just said that the anterior deltoid and the biceps muscle store the energy to bring the arm forward. What happened to your bicep muscle when you pronated your hand? Oops, it switched off. Now you don't have the energy to bring the arm forward. So keeping the thumb up is real important. If you got somebody that you can't break them of this, have them carry 2 relay batons. When they turn their hand down, oosh, they hit themselves. This gets them to change very quickly. And so, and then, I was listening to, thumbs up, palms facing in. I like to teach hands open, although if someone wants to pretend that they're holding a butterfly in their hand, or they're holding a light flower, so that their hands are a little bit cupped, I'm still okay with that, as long as they don't clench their fist. Yeah? And so, hammer the hands back is what Kevin McNair's cue was, and I still think that's a good cue. So, Charlie Francis and many other people have talked about punching the arm forward, and how punching the arm forward facilitates flexion at the hip on the opposite side. And after I did enough research and playing with the athletes and getting their impressions, I changed my mind. And so punching the hands forward, so you're punching here, not punching the little person, but you're punching here. That will facilitate the thigh coming forward on the opposite side. And so you go to shoulder level, elbow stays open. So if you see this and this, so you see shoulder flexion followed by elbow flexion, the athlete is buying time. That usually means that this leg, the opposite side leg, is dangling behind the body, and they're not bringing it forward soon enough. And so even though you might not be able to see that, you can tell that by the arm action. Now, don't do both of these at the same time. Because if you do, you'll end up fighting yourself. Yeah? You either focus on one and then focus on the other. And so, for example, in the race model, 100-meter race model that we won't have time to talk about, in the first 15 meters, you want to punch, punch, punch. From 15 to 35, you want to drive back. From 35 to 60, you want to punch again. From 60 to 80, you want to drive. And from 80 to 100, you want to punch again. And so that goes along with the race model, how we divide up the different sections and what the athlete is thinking about. Pop, 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 drive taller, step over, grab back, hot track. And so that you can actually use the arms to link that in. Now you might recognize that guy. This is Su Bing Tian in his second year with us. He didn't look like that in his first year. So look at how he doesn't get full extension at the knee joint at takeoff. Notice how the thigh doesn't go back when he takes off. The thigh pops forward, and then he lifts the heel up and forward. And you can see when the shin is parallel, the knee is at 90 degrees. And then you will see him step over the opposite knee. Then the next phase is when the thigh reaches full flexion. And then you'll see how his foot grabs back, but he plantar flexes too soon. So you can see the foot actually get jarred when he lands on the ground. It should not get that feeling like it's being crushed. And then the last thing, look at his arm action. You see how when he goes forward, there's elbow flexion, so we know there's something going on down below that's causing that. At the end of this training season was 2015. He ran his first 9.99 at the Prefontaine Classic in Eugene, Oregon, and then ran 9.99 at the World Championships in Beijing in the semifinal and made it to the final. So let's take a break, and we're going to talk about, teaching progressions and learning routines for maximum velocity.
Thank you so much, Lauren.